And looking at the turn of the century and by describing how quickly cities had grown and how quickly American society had changed, there was really only natural for there to be some new reforms that were introduced. But really, most of these new reforms that we're going to begin discussing were really simply continuations of reforms that had started long before. So, if you remember the Grange was going to focus on helping farmers. The Populist kind of took over what the Grange had started and added workers to that. So, the Populist tried to help farmers and workers. Suffragist, when you hear the word suffrage, remember the word suffrage means right to vote. So when we talk about suffragist, in this instance, we are talking about women's right to vote. So there were people who were pushing for women's right to vote. And then the temperance movement. Temperance was working to ban alcohol, both the sale and consumption of alcohol. So when we look at the reforms we're going to start looking at today, these are all just going to be continuing on the tradition that had been started much earlier. One of the problems in our society that many people believed was that there was a wealth gap. This is going to be determined looking at that huge gap between the very, very wealthy, your Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Morgans, and then your worker, those who were working for just a few cents a day. So that's going to talk about that wealth gap. There was very little in between, but this huge gap in between those two social classes and the amount of money they made. There were basically no social services at this point in time. Our whole modern idea in 2016 of welfare and food stamps and unemployment benefits and disability benefits, none of those types of social services existed at the turn of the century. So there was really no help there for anyone who actually really needed it. So when people looked at society, they looked for what they believed were needed improvements in social welfare, moral improvement, that would have included things like temperance, just bettering society, economic reform, making it so that those really wealthy could not take advantage of the less fortunate because they were so wealthy, and all of the advantages they had from those unfair economic practices. And finally, efficiency. Everyone believed that if our companies worked more efficiently, that then they would be able to not only have better costs for consumers, but would be able to treat everyone more fairly as well. At this point in time, there begins to grow a fear of revolution. When you look at who makes up the largest part of society, it's your lower classes. It were those Americans who were working for just a few cents a day, almost not getting by, and really being taken advantage of. The idea of socialism is the idea that the government should own and operate all industry for the benefit of the people, so that essentially no individual owned the companies that these people were working for. Now, while many people would argue there is less freedom, one of the benefits of socialism in an ideal world is the fact that there would be really no poverty. And if you look at our society at this point in time, there were many who were living in severe poverty and who were being exploited on a daily basis. So when you look at the idea that there is a possibility that your lowest classes, if they wanted to, if they organized, could rise up and possibly even overthrow the upper class. This starts to be a real concern, especially when you have guys like Henry George, who writes the essay Progress and Poverty, in which he introduces something called the single tax concept. This is the idea that, again, land should be for common use, and that the land itself, and not the improvements made on that land, is what should be taxed, and that taxes on other things like your income should not be taxed, because the tax for the land would be enough to make up for all of that income tax. So this is going to be one of those socialist ideas that begins to be introduced at the turn of the century that really gains a lot of momentum because a lot of people looked at that idea and thought it was a great idea. Now, Edward Bellamy has a little bit different of a story. He wrote a book called Looking Backward. And in his book, it's the tale of this ideal socialist society where the main character falls asleep and wakes up in the year 2000. Obviously, at this point in time, that's far into the future. And when he looks at society, it is this ideal, almost perfect society in which our country had turned into a socialist government. So this was going to gain a lot of traction with people and causes a lot of conversation about what our government should look like and what should it be working for and trying to accomplish. And should we be hanging on to our capitalist ideas? So the whole idea of socialism really gains a lot of traction, partly because of all the poverty. You see here on the left is someone we have talked about before, that is Eugene V. Debs. He had been the leader of the Industrial Railroad Workers, of those industrial unions that we talked about when we talked about labor unions. He was the leader of this movement, specifically of the American Socialist Party. So he was a proclaimed socialist. Remember, he had not been socialist to begin with, but he was arrested during a major strike. When he goes to prison, he comes back out and he turned socialist, meaning, again, socialism, that the government should own industry for the benefit of the people. So he's the leader of the American Socialist Party and also the IWW, which stands for the Industrial Workers of the World, who were nicknamed the Wobblies. Again, guys, there were so many working class people who were very, very poor that socialism sounded like such a great idea that no one would be poor, and that was very appealing to many people. And you will see that Eugene V. Debs runs for president numerous times. He never wins, but at one point he does gain quite a bit of the vote. In seeing all these problems, you finally begin to see a group of people called the progressives emerge. If you look at that word progressives, you see the word progress, and that's exactly what they wanted. This is the name that we give to the reformers of the early 1900s, the people who collectively wanted to see change. And this is a very broad term, and it falls over many different types of reformers who wanted different things, but all wanted that reform in society. One of the biggest problems that most of these reformers believed was that our democracy and our individual rights were being threatened by all of the big business. Again, think of your Rockefellers and Carnegies and Morgans. They believed they were taking advantage of and really negatively impacting our democracy. So they want to change all that. And these are mostly going to be middle class reformers, so they're not really going to be your poor, although it did include some of those. These are mostly people who just look around and they see that there are some big problems that they felt like could bring about some change to. Again, that progress in our society. The social gospel movement, which we have already discussed, was that idea that people should help those who are less fortunate based on that Christian principle. It is going to include many religious groups, including groups like the Salvation Army, whose goal was to help the less fortunate. Now remember, this is the complete opposite of social Darwinism. Remember, social Darwinism was the idea that those who were the best were going to get rich and rise to the top. And it was used to justify their wealth and to justify poverty. So that is going to be the opposite. Social gospel is the opposite of social Darwinism. We start to see journalists, a group of journalists who begin to try to expose all of this problems in our society. And they're given the nickname muckrakers because they basically stirred up a lot of trouble. They tried to expose all of the corruption, all of the graft, all of the practices that they believed were wrong in our society just to bring it to everyone's attention. Our social problems, they wanted people who otherwise might not have known or seen. They wanted them to be aware of what was going on in our country. Women like Ida Tarbell, who you see here on the top right, she criticized Standard Oil. She went after J.D. Rockefeller and tried to expose all of the tactics that he used and the corruption that she believed was associated with Standard Oil. Upton Sinclair kind of inadvertently goes after the meatpacking industry. He writes a book called The Jungle that was supposed to be about the lives of immigrants and how difficult their lives were. But it winds up the thing that people remember about this book the most was what they discovered from the meatpacking industry. And finally, Lincoln Steffens, who is going to try to expose all of the corruption that had been in government. So you will see all of these journalists together be writing about different issues that they felt very strongly about in an effort to try to bring about that change or progress in our society.